In a world run by powerful elites, the foxes and the lions, I think it's become fairly clear that in today's day and age, free speech is an illusion. From school teachers to university professors and journalists to content creators, we are all at risk of getting silenced, shut down, and in some cases, even persecuted simply for speaking the truth. And I remember thinking this when Meghan Markle was at the South by Southwest Festival, just openly, unabashedly calling for the censorship of YouTubers online behind the guise of battling disinformation, misinformation, racism, and misogyny. All things which, ironically, she specializes in. And this is why we talk about them. I said in podcast 98 that Meghan and Harry are excellent examples of everything that is wrong with the world, including this plutocracy that we now find ourselves in. One that is plunging us into a dark age of poverty and divisiveness, and most pertinent to today's video, censorship. If there's anything good that's accidentally come from the likes of Meghan and Harry, it's the countless examples that they've oh so magnanimously provided us with of not only how deep this issue of censorship runs, but how openly it is practiced, not just by them, but by practically everyone in a position of power. Now, we've talked extensively about the lengths that Meghan and Harry in particular have gone to censor us, especially the media and independent content creators such as myself, but even small school children under the age of 10 in Harlem. They've tried lawsuits, they've tried canceling people, they've even tried to shut down content creators, either directly by, having friends in high places, or through their rabid Sussex squad. They've effectively dedicated the last, I would say 5 years since 2019, of their lives to demonizing the very mediums that threaten them the most, by painting these platforms as evil, addictive things that need a warning at least, and need to be militantly policed to their strict standards at worst. So the question that always lingers in one's mind, at least mine, is this: will they eventually succeed? Certain creators have indeed been shut down or demonetized for speaking out against them. We remember how Piers Morgan back in 2021 was effectively fired from ITV simply for stating that he didn't believe Meghan's claims on Oprah, most of which indeed turned out to be lies. So one could argue that they've scarily already managed to succeed at this point, but not to the extent that they would like. So are we, the common folk, sentenced to be silenced by the elite few? Or is there something we can do about it? Well, as with most things in life, to have any hopes of answering this critical question, one must look back to the past. Because far from being a new age problem, this issue of censorship is as old as humanity itself. Last year, I made a video about patterns of human behavior and how they keep taking place cyclically, endlessly, and how we could use these patterns to predict future behavior quite accurately. Now, that video was done entirely empirically, so based on my observations of the world. But it turns out that it's an actual phenomenon, and one that is not just restricted to human beings. Like living things, civilizations have a life cycle. They are created, they grow and prosper into a so-called golden age, and then, usually due to corruption and greed, they descend into a dark age before they ultimately collapse. And then rinse and repeat, the cycle begins anew. And this interpretation of history as a repeating cycle of dark and golden ages is by no means a novel concept. It was a commonly held belief amongst ancient cultures, put forth as early as during the classical Greek era of Plato and later his student Aristotle, but never as succinctly as by Greek historian Polybius of the Hellenistic period, in a theory he called anacyclosis. meaning the cycle of revolutions or the cycle of constitutions, more commonly known today as the social cycle theory, and which was profoundly influential on the founding fathers of the United States' vision of the republic that they wished to create after the American Revolution of the 18th century. Anacyclosis ventures deep into the 6 regime archetypes formulated by the Greeks that we still use today, being monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and ochlocracy or mob rule, where each archetype represents the different life stages of political evolution. But fear not, the intricacies of this topic are far beyond the scope of this video, so all we will take from it is this concept of history repeating itself in patterns, particularly as it pertains to what the likes of Meghan and Harry wish to do, which is not just silence their critics, but silence the truth itself. Throughout history, there have been several instances of independent thinkers and truth seekers getting silenced simply for being against the grain or for speaking the truth. One of the earliest and perhaps the most notorious incidences of this took place in ancient Greece, not long after the Peloponnesian War in 399 BC, when Socrates, a hero of the aforementioned war, and a man who was considered by many to be the founding figure of Western philosophy, was tried and executed for what was officially alleged to be impiety and corrupting the youth. Seeing as Socrates himself never wrote anything down, and no written court records survive other than the eyewitness accounts of Plato and the Apology, which doesn't actually mean apology, by the way, it's from the Greek word apologia, meaning speaking in defense, and the second-hand account of Xenophon, who wasn't even there at the trial. So we can only speculate as to the true motivations behind Socrates' prosecution. Some say it was because of his once close association with 2 former pupils of his, although Plato's version of Socrates disputes ever having students, one called Alcibiades, an Athenian politician, and Critias, a member of the oligarchy called the 30 Tyrants, who both individually spearheaded 2 movements that temporarily overthrew Athenian democracy in a bloody revolt. So one can see how this can be packaged into a corrupting the youth of Athens charge. The alternative reason behind his prosecution, being the one that is most relevant to today's topic, is that Socrates, who famously wasn't a fan of Athenian democracy and questioned everything and everyone around him in his quest for truth and knowledge, constantly challenged the status quo and embarrassed the elite by publicly exposing their ignorance, which seems very likely, mostly because we still see this happening today. Those in power do not like their mistakes and misdeeds getting exposed. As for the impiety charge, to keep things brief, piety in Athens required not just a belief in the gods, but the observation of rites, prayers, and the offering of sacrifices to keep them happy, so to speak. And from what accounts we have, Socrates preferred to worship in his own way, without the conventional rituals of the time, and he may have even questioned their necessity. Otherwise, according to Xenophon's account, the impiety charge stemmed from Socrates' claim of having direct communication with a divine voice, although we're not sure if he meant this literally or if he was merely talking about his intuition. Whatever the reasoning, we know that Socrates was eventually found guilty by a majority and was sentenced to death, albeit after failing to provide a viable alternative such as exile, which could have been what the accusers actually wanted all along. Again, we'll never know. Socrates' trial is the only instance in which an Athenian was legally prosecuted not for an overt crime that directly harmed an individual or society at large, for example, through assault, murder, treason, corruption, or slander, but for an alleged harm that was caused indirectly by his Socratic method. And what's really fascinating and what stands out in this story is Socrates' commitment to the truth, so much so that he had a chance to flee. He had friends in high places who could have gotten him out of the country safely, but he chose to face his accusers, knowing that it would most likely lead to his death. And this extreme form of censorship, along with this extreme display of bravery and commitment to the truth, did not stop there. At the dawn of 17th century Italy, an unconventional Italian philosopher and mathematician called Giordano Bruno had his tongue gagged and was burnt at the stake by the Roman Inquisition after refusing to recant 8 heretical propositions that defied the church's teachings at the time. Now, unfortunately, 6 of these 8 propositions have been lost to time, with the surviving 2 being questioning the sacrament of reconciliation and the concept of transmigrating souls or reincarnation on other planets instead of going to the afterlife. Bruno was also famous for espousing scientific theories which we now know to be true, such as the heliocentric nature of solar systems, first theorized by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus in his book On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, which I have just placed an order for, and I'm very excited to get and read because this is the book that started a revolution, but we'll get to it. However, several historians argue that this did not factor into his heresy and subsequent execution. Since the remaining 6 heretical propositions will forever be unknown to us, we'll probably never know if these scientific theories were included among the list. But we do know that Bruno lost his life simply for having unconventional beliefs and theories that were deemed heretical by the ultimate gatekeeper of information at the time. More famously, Bruno's peer, Galileo Galilei, whom I named my cat after, by the way, Leo is actually short for Galileo, had not 1 but 2 accusations of heresy from the Roman Inquisition regarding the Copernican or heliocentric theory. Once in 1615, after he defended the theory based on his astronomical observations through a telescope in 1609, the findings of which he published a year later in a short astronomical treatise he called Siderius Nuncius. It is important to note, though, that the treatise isn't what put him in hot water, since it would be a full 5 years after its publication until he went to Rome to defend his work. Rather, it was his ardent claims in a letter to a friend penned in 1613, in which he declared, among other things, that heliocentrism was in fact not contrary to biblical texts, referencing, for instance, Joshua chapter 10, verse 12 of the Bible to back up his theory, and that in any case, the Bible was not an authority on science, but rather on faith and morals, and so we shouldn't be looking to it at all for scientific proof of anything. In early 1616, the Inquisition found his defense of the theory to be, quote, foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Interestingly, when Galileo published another book on the theory in 1632, titled Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, after staying away from the topic for a decade, he did so with formal authorization from the Inquisition and papal permission, likely due to his close friendship with the then Pope, Urban VIII. There was a condition from the Pope, though, which was for the book to contain arguments for and against heliocentrism, rather than advocating for it, which Galileo appeared to have ignored. That humiliated the Pope, which then started the unfortunate chain of events that eventually led to his formal trial with the Inquisition for heresy in 1633. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy and was sentenced to life under house arrest, with a proviso that he agreed to immediately cease his so-called heresy, a condition which he did abide by to save his own life. All of his teachings were banned by the church as part of his sentence, and it took more than 3 centuries for the church to finally admit that Galileo was right and to clear his name of heresy. When we listen to these stories of old today, and just how ridiculous they sound when something that is so factual, such as the heliocentric nature of solar systems, is seen as so heretical, so sacrilege, that it warrants death. You think about that now, you go, wow, they were really closed-minded back then. It seems like a draconian problem of a bygone era. But when you've lived in this world long enough, and if you've been observant enough, then you'd realize that nothing's really changed. Because we inhabit a world now where pretenders are placed on far-reaching platforms to deceive us and feed their insatiable egos. A world where people aren't allowed to have opposing or unconventional, perhaps, opinions and beliefs, with the elites dictating what is conventional and what is not. I mean, isn't that what misinformation and disinformation is all about? them trying to police what is correct, I mean, that in itself is a major red flag, and very similar to what the Inquisition did all those years ago. Like days of old, we live in a world where truth tellers are suppressed and demonetized or shut down or thrown in prisons to rot and lose their minds, and at times even murdered, all for exposing the truth. Going back to Socrates for a moment, once the majority of the jury voted in favor of the death penalty, he told them that his trial came about because of humanity's reluctance or even aversion to self-examination. They don't want to know the truth about themselves, and so they despise and lash out at anyone who even asks them to do so. More recently, Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist whose first 19 years of life were spent in exile with his family in China, after his father, who was a famous Chinese poet, was accused of being a rightist during the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong, has since personally experienced the sinister effects of censorship and political persecution, not just in his homeland of China, but in the Western world. He recently stated that censorship arises from the vulnerability of power. When power is weak and unable to confront the truth, censorship becomes apparent. This situation hinders the development of a truly civilized society and instead propels it towards regression. And without going into too much detail of examples of this happening today, because, well, some topics are off limits, this is happening right now as we speak. And it's crazy to think that in 2024, we are in the midst of a censorship crisis that really isn't too unlike the Inquisition of old. Back to the question I posed earlier. Will the likes of Meghan and Harry, these elites or people who have friends in high places, eventually succeed in censoring the truth tellers among us? Honestly, with our current trajectory, I would say yes. I mean, I can speak from a personal perspective when it comes to the Meghan and Harry community. They have successfully shut down and demonetized channels. I've said this earlier. And when they fail to do that through YouTube, they sick their Sussex squad on content creators to dox them and stalk them, harass them, basically bully them off social media, which is in effect censorship because they've stopped them from speaking the truth. But as I said, Meghan and Harry are simply a symptom, right? They're just an example, rather, of much bigger issues that are in play in today's world. They're far from the only ones doing this. They're just dumb enough to do it out in the open. But can we put a stop to this censorship crisis? If we consider the concept of anacyclosis that I explained earlier, we see that a change in the power structure occurs only after the ruling class at the time becomes corrupt, leading to a revolution by another group that then takes over the seat of power and changes the status quo. So for example, if we refer back to the Inquisition in 16th, 17th century Europe, it obviously came to an end at some point, right? Even if it didn't happen permanently, even if we now find ourselves in a dark age once again, there was once a golden age. So the question is not if it's possible, because we know it is, but how is it possible? The Polish astronomer I referenced earlier, Nicholas Copernicus, may have inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, sparked a fire when he published on the revolutions of heavenly spheres in 1543. One that eventually led to a new wave of scientific thought that washed through the continent, resulting in the scientific revolution, which was a period that saw experimentation, logic, basically scientific reasoning, entirely replace religion as the focal point of European civilization at the time. Now, this scientific revolution, which was not a violent revolution, mind you, that came later in the form of the French Revolution, which was one of the bloodiest at the time, and I hope we never replicate. But it was only made possible after these important scientific thinkers that we talked about, such as Copernicus himself, and Giordano Bruno, and Galileo, and even Isaac Newton after them, to name a few, began to seriously challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. Suddenly, information was no longer tightly controlled by the Church. It was made available to anyone who wanted to learn, and learn the people did, paving the way to the Age of Enlightenment. And this is where we get to why censorship exists in the first place. Because knowledge is power. And the more knowledge the people amass, the more powerful they become. When information flows freely to all of us in all its forms, not dictated to us through propaganda and through misinformation and disinformation campaigns, but when we're left to decide what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, we start to question, as Socrates did before us, everything around us. And we start to wonder why the status quo is the way that it is, especially when the status quo leaves the majority of people, those that are not in the 1%, in a very dire situation. You know, right now we're talking cost of living crisis, inflation, unemployment, mental health crisis, people unable to pay their rent, let alone buy a home. I'm part of that generation where we may never own a home. And when the people are informed and realize that this doesn't need to be the status quo, it doesn't have to be this way, that then leads to a revolution. That's what led to the French Revolution. The people were starving, they were destitute, they were vastly unhappy, while the monarchy thrived until it was too much. And while I don't condone how the French Revolution was implemented, I think it was such an unnecessary bloodbath. And mind you, that was because those who then took power, not Napoleon, those before him, like Robespierre, I think is how you say his name, a lawyer, a fellow lawyer, were corrupt as well. So it's interesting. The people who end up overthrowing the status quo aren't necessarily the best people to do it sometimes. And then you get the French Revolution as an example. But it doesn't have to be that way, because we know now that the scientific revolution took the peaceful way, as it were. Rather than blood and violence, these scientific thinkers used their intelligence and, most importantly, their bravery and their unwavering commitment to the truth, even in the face of death or demonetization, if you're a YouTuber like myself. And on that note, I'm going to stop here before I get myself demonetized.